A very rich man paid a homeless woman to have his baby. When the child was born, he was shocked by what he saw. Before we begin, comment below with the city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone. Henry Lewis was a 42-year-old, a very rich man pays a homeless woman to have his baby. When the child is born, he is shocked by what he sees. Before we begin, comment below with the city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone. Henry Lewis was a 42-year-old man who had everything: money, power, status. One night, he realized that despite all the luxury around him, there was one thing his money hadn't bought: an heir. He needed a child. Henry didn't want a family in the traditional sense. He had tried twice. Both marriages ended in failure and disappointment. He thought love was an illusion, something that only brought problems. A child was different. It was an investment, a continuation of everything he had built. Now he was determined not to seek a relationship. Henry needed a clear agreement, he just needed a contract. He knew that with his money, he could find someone willing to carry his baby without asking questions or getting emotionally involved. Henry. This was just a business deal. Like all his deals, he would have total control. Now, he just needed to find someone who would accept the deal. The next morning, Henry Lewis drove his sports car through the city streets. His mind, however, was focused on finding someone who would accept the contract. While stopped at a light near downtown, something caught his attention. On the corner of the sidewalk, a young woman sat on the ground. She was drawing on a piece of dirty paper. She had messy brown hair falling over her face. Her blue eyes showed despite her tired hair. She seemed invisible to others. Something about her caught Henry's eye. He tried to ignore her. When the light turned green, he looked again and thought, who draws on the sidewalk as if nothing else exists? Annoyed with himself, he sped away, leaving her behind. A few blocks away, something bothered him. He stopped in a parking lot and sat there, staring at the steering wheel. Then he had an idea. This is ridiculous, he said to himself. But he followed his instinct. Reluctantly, he turned the car around and went back to where he had seen her. There she was. Just the same. Leaning the paper against the wall. He pulled up to the curb and rolled down the window. His tone was direct and cold. "Hey. You," he said. The young woman looked at him with suspicion. Her eyes narrowed. Evaluating the well, a man dressed in a suit and driving a sports car approached her. She hesitated. "I'm not asking," he said. "I don't have all day," he insisted, not changing his tone. Slowly and reluctantly, she approached the car. When she finally stood next to it, her thinness and the wear on her appearance were even more evident. Despite this, there was something in her posture and the way she looked at him. "What does this mean?" "You want?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Henry studied her for a moment before responding. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere we can talk." She laughed dryly. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're thinking." Henry frowned, clearly irritated by the assumption. "Don't be absurd. I don't have time for that. I just want to talk. Now get in the car. You can keep living on the sidewalk." She hesitated. His firm tone left her no room to disagree. Finally, she opened the door and got in. The silence between them and the car was uncomfortable. Henry didn't seem to care. He drove to a quiet cafe, far from the city noise. Parked. "What's your name?" he asked as they sat at a table in the corner of Layla Parker. "Why does it matter?" she retorted, keeping a suspicious look. "I need to know who I'm dealing with. Tell me." "Layla. Why do you sit on the sidewalk? Drawing as if nothing else matters." She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I lost everything." "That's none of your business." He leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the table. "I'll get straight to the point. I want to make you an offer that can change your life." Her eyes narrowed. "What would that be?" "I want you to have a child for me." "You're joking. Right?" "No. It's a serious offer. I'll cover all your expenses and give you full support during the pregnancy. In the end, you'll get an amount that will ensure you never have to worry about money again." She let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms. "This is a joke. Right?" she asked. "What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger?" "The kind of man who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time. I don't want a relationship. I don't want emotional drama. Just a child. Simple as that." Layla stared at Henry as if he had lost his mind. His words echoed in her mind. "I want you to have my child." As much as she wanted to dismiss his proposal as absurd, something in Henry's gaze told her he was absolutely serious. His cold logic hit her hard, leaving her torn between her dignity and the harsh reality of her life. "Is madness." Layla finally spoke up. No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this. Henry didn't look away. He kept the same natural posture. That came so naturally to him. "No woman in your position would refuse." He replied bluntly. "I'm offering you a way out. Comfort. Stability. A new life in exchange for something you already have. The ability to have a child." Layla crossed her arms, trying to seem resistant. Deep down, she knew he was right. She was in a situation where every day was a struggle to survive. Even so, the idea of giving up something so personal for money made her feel sick. "Then what?" she asked, her voice heavy with skepticism. "What happens after the baby is born?" Henry relaxed slightly in his chair, as if he had anticipated the question. "After the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum to start your life over. No strings attached. You'll be free to do whatever you want. No strings attached." She let out a humorless laugh. "And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into court later?" He studied her carefully before answering. "Layla, I'm a businessman. I don't enter into agreements without ensuring all parties benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract. Neither of us will be able to change the terms afterward. Now, let's have a little fun with those who. Only those who read this far will understand. Type milkshake in the comments." Back to the story. Layla fell silent, absorbing his words. The promise of security, even if temporary, was tempting. She had nothing now, not even a place to sleep that night. She also knew she was on the verge of making a life. She fell silent, absorbing his words. The promise of security, even if temporary, was tempting. She had nothing now, not even a place to sleep that night. But she also knew she was on the verge of making a life-altering decision. "And what if I say no?" she challenged, leaning slightly forward. Henry gave a faint smile. "Then you go back to the streets." You keep scraping by. Facing the cold and the hunger. The choice is yours. His words landed like a blow. She wanted to hate him for being so blunt. She hated the truth more than him. He had backed her into a corner. She knew it. But there was one more thing she needed to ask: why are you doing this? She demanded. A man like you. With all your money. Why not adopt a child? Or find one of those wealthy women who love showing off their perfect kids? Henry took a deep breath before answering. His tone serious. Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. Because adopting or getting involved with someone in my social circle brings complications I'm not willing to deal with. I want control. Layla. Nothing more. Nothing less. The coldness in his words made her look away. Unsettled. She knew he was being honest. Which only made her feel more vulnerable. I need time to think, she said finally. Trying to regain some control over the situation. Henry nodded as if he had expected this response. You have 24 hours later. Don't bother contacting me. He stood up and walked toward the door without saying anything else. Layla watched as he disappeared. Feeling like she was being pulled into a whirlwind she might never escape. Walking through the streets. Layla's thoughts raced. Henry's words echoed in her mind: comfort. Stability. A new life. Life. She understood all too well what it meant to have nothing. The cold night made her skin hurt. A reminder that tomorrow would bring the same struggles. The fight for food. The constant fear. The humiliation of being invisible to the world. She sat on a park bench. Staring at the gray sky. Her mother used to say that. Opportunities only come once. It's up to you to decide whether to take them or let them pass. But what are the consequences? She wondered. Having a child, even as part of a deal, was a big decision. But what if it was her only chance to escape the never-ending cycle of sadness? Meanwhile, Henry sat in his living room, reviewing a contract. His lawyers had carefully prepared. He hated waiting. He knew Layla didn't have many options. Regardless, he had already calculated the risks. If she declined, he would move on to someone else. Simple as that. The sound of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. He picked up. Hearing his receptionist's voice inform him that Layla had arrived. Send her up, he replied. His tone neutral. Minutes later. The door opened and Layla walked in. Her eyes were tired but determined. I accept, she said bluntly. Before Henry could say anything, he stood up. Observing her carefully. There was no hesitation in her expression. Just a firm decision. Great. Let's make this official. He motioned for she sat while he picked up the contract from the table. Layla looked at the document and read the terms carefully. The conditions were clear: she would be taken care of throughout her pregnancy. With all her expenses paid. In the end, she would receive a significant amount of money to restart her life. In return, she would give up any rights to the child. This seems final, she said quietly as she read. That's exactly what I want. Henry replied, and I hope it's what you want. 2. Layla took a deep breath. After a moment of hesitation, she picked up the pen. With a quick motion, she signed her name, sealing the agreement that would change their lives forever. The signing of the contract was more than just a business deal. It marked a new phase in Layla Parker's life. On that same day, Stephanie, Henry's assistant, escorted her to a black car waiting at the building's entrance. As she looked out the car window, the city, which had once felt overwhelming, now seemed to offer something different, a chance to start over. Layla didn't say much on the way to Henry's mansion. Stephanie tried to make conversation. "You'll like the place," she said. "It's quiet, spacious. Most importantly, comfortable." The friendly tone contrasted with the cold environment of the contract she had just signed. Layla just nodded, still thinking about everything that had happened in the past few hours. When the car finally arrived at the mansion, her eyes widened. The monumental iron gate opened, revealing a property surrounded by impeccably maintained gardens. At the center was the mansion, an imposing marble and the glass structure seemed as cold and calculating as the man who owned it. Stephanie led her inside. Layla barely had time to take in the extravagant details. There were crystal chandeliers, wide marble staircases, furniture that looked like it came straight out of a design magazine. This wasn't her world. For now it would be her new reality. "I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Layla followed in silence. Upon entering the room, she was greeted by a huge bed with linen sheets to ceiling windows and a bathroom larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie added before leaving her alone. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft fabric of the sheets. It was strange until yesterday. She had been sleeping on cold sidewalks. Now she was surrounded by luxury. But as comfortable as it was, there was still something heavy in the air. She knew she wasn't a guest, she was part of a business deal. In the days that followed, Layla tried to adjust to the new routine. Meals were served quickly. A team of doctors was hired to conduct initial exams. As expected, Henry kept his distance. He was focused on work and rarely appeared around the house, except to check the report Stephanie gave him on Layla's progress. On one of those rare occasions, they crossed paths in the hallway. Layla was leaving a medical appointment when she saw Henry walking toward her, with his usual perfect posture and serious expression. "Are you okay?" he asked. His tone made it clear that he was only doing it because he felt he had to. Layla hesitated before answering. "Everything is as expected, I guess," he said. Then nodded, not wanting to talk about it more. However, before walking away, he gave her one last look. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well," he said. She didn't know what to make of that comment. Was it genuine kindness? Just a way to ensure the agreement went smoothly? Either way, that brief encounter lingered in her mind. Although she was being treated like a queen, named Layla was having a hard time. One night, she went to her room's balcony and looked at the big garden. It was lit up by the moonlight. Everything was calm. It was very different from the world she knew. Was she doing the right thing? She asked herself, hugging herself against the cold wind. The idea of having a baby and then giving it away was becoming more and more difficult to understand. The contract clearly said that she would not have any rights to the baby. She didn't know that. How would she react emotionally? Meanwhile, Henry watched from a distance. He knew Layla was strong. He also knew she was carrying a lot of emotional weight. Despite his cold attitude, he felt a little curious about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual proposal? Why couldn't he shake the feeling that maybe she was more than just part of a plan? One evening, Layla was in the living room, looking through a book. Henry liked classic literature. He also liked the quiet and the scent of old books. Henry walked in, surprising her. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents in his hand. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied sarcastically. He frowned but didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat down in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. He said, "I think so." She answered hesitantly. "But it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Henry leaned forward slightly and said, "It doesn't have to feel strange. This is a contract. Layla. This is an agreement. I promise everything will be carried out exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said with a hint of defiance. "Plan everything. Calculate everything. Leave no room for mistakes." He looked at her closely, as if deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing. "That's how I've built everything. I have a plan to prevent failure," he finally replied. "Sometimes failure is inevitable," Layla said, shaking her head. "You can plan everything. You can't control how you feel." Henry felt like she had hit him with her words. He leaned back in his chair without replying. Layla noticed his reaction but didn't say anything more. She simply picked up the book from the shelf and headed to her room, leaving Henry alone, deep in thought. The days went by. Layla Parker began adjusting to life in Henry Lewis's mansion. The environment was grand and comfortable. She felt out of place. The expensive furniture and decorations made her feel like this wasn't her place. But she followed the routine. She had frequent medical appointments and meals prepared by chefs. Despite the comfort, she felt empty. At night, alone in her room, she thought about what she had left behind. She didn't have much. It was the only life she had known. Now, she felt out of control. What would it be like to carry a child and then hand it over? She tried to push those thoughts away. They haunted her, especially in the "It was a quiet night." Layla was dealing with her feelings. Henry watched her from far away. He was calm. He was also interested in her. Even though he had a lot to do and a lot of meetings, he often thought about her. He wasn't romantic or emotional about it. He was interested. He couldn't explain it. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Henry returned home and found Layla in the garden. She was sitting on a bench, looking at the sky. This was different from how he imagined her. He hesitated to approach her, eventually walked over. He enjoyed the garden and asked her. Henry didn't know how to explain. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Henry found Layla in the garden. She was sitting on a bench, looking at the sky. This was different from how he imagined her. He didn't know if he should go to her or not. He eventually walked over to her. He enjoyed the garden and asked her, "It's nice, right? Definitely better than the streets." He sat beside her. He kept some distance. There was something disarming about Layla's honesty. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Layla shrugged, looking at the flowers in front of her. "It still feels strange." In a direct tone. Layla turned slightly surprised but quickly responded, "It's nice. It's definitely better than the streets." He sat beside her. keeping some distance. There was something disarming about Layla's honesty. "Are you settling in?" he asked. "It still feels strange," Layla replied, looking at the flowers in front of her. "It's like I'm living someone else's life." Henry remained silent for a moment before replying. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned?" she echoed with a hint of irony. "Do you always live like this? Do you plan every second of your life?" Henry looked at her, surprised. "You're always planning every detail of your life?" Layla asked, surprised. "People usually agree with you and don't question you. Planning is essential for everything to function." Henry replied firmly. "Without it, everything falls apart. I don't think everything can be controlled," Layla said, shaking her head. "Sometimes things just happen, whether you like it or not." Her words unsettled him more than he expected. He stood up abruptly, ending the conversation. "If you need anything, let Stephanie know," he said before heading back inside the house. A few days later, Henry decided to accompany Layla to one of her medical appointments. He justified his presence by saying he wanted to ensure "it's like I'm living someone else's life." Henry didn't say anything for a moment before answering. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned," she echoed, her voice carrying a hint of irony. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Henry looked at her, surprised by everything that was going on. But deep down, he felt more and more responsible for the situation. Layla didn't show any surprise. She was intrigued by his decision. At the doctor's office, the usual examinations were conducted. For the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Layla felt an unexpected emotion. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to hide it. Henry, on the other hand, remained still. His expression was hard to read. Something in his gaze had changed. It was as if that simple sound had touched something inside him that he wasn't prepared to face. "Everything looks perfect," said the doctor, smiling. "You can start thinking. Like I'm living someone else's life?" Henry didn't say anything for a moment before answering. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned," she echoed, a hint of irony in her voice. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Henry looked at her, surprised by what she wanted to do next. "Like prenatal care and the next steps?" Layla nodded. Henry remained silent. On the way back to the mansion, the silence in the car was heavy. Henry was visibly thoughtful. Layla couldn't find the right words to fill the space between them. When they finally arrived, he opened the door. "Do you always live like this?" she asked, surprised. "Planning every second of your life?" "Thank you for today," Layla said as she got out of the car. "It was the least I could do. I'll make sure everything continues to go well," Henry replied, not looking directly at her. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." Layla watched him as he walked into the mansion. His posture was always impeccable. There was something, "It's like I'm living someone else's life." Henry didn't say anything for a moment before answering. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned," she echoed, a hint of irony in her voice. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Henry looked at her, surprised by her different behavior. Maybe the sound of her heartbeat had touched a part of Henry that he kept hidden. Maybe it was just her imagination. In the following days, Layla began to notice small changes. Henry appeared more frequently in the common areas of the house. Their conversations, though brief, seemed less mechanical. He asked about the details of her appointments, how she was feeling, even suggested activities to help her relax. One night, while they were dining in silence at the large dining table, Henry broke the habit and asked, "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over?" Layla was surprised by the question. Was the first time he had shown any interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she replied honestly. "I still don't know what my life will be like after this." Henry nodded, seeming to consider her answer. "You'll have the resources to start over wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." Layla looked at him. "Like I'm living someone else's life?" Henry didn't say anything for a moment before answering. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned," she echoed, a hint of irony in her voice. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Henry looked at her, surprised by her words, also intrigued. Behind the calculated coldness, there seemed to be a trace of genuine concern. She didn't know how to interpret it. For the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in the mansion. One morning, Layla found a package left at the entrance of her room. It was a gift, wrapped impeccably with a small, handwritten note, to help with her free time. Inside was a new sketchbook and high-quality pencils. Layla was speechless. She didn't know that Henry knew about her love for drawing. During one of their early conversations, she had casually mentioned how she used to draw to distract herself. She never expected him to remember, let alone care. That night, while she was in the garden, Henry passed by her and stopped for a moment. "Did you like the gift?" he asked casually. "Yes," Layla replied, holding the sketchbook. "Thank you. I didn't expect this," Henry shrugged. "It seemed like something that could be good for you," Layla said, smiling and holding the gift more tightly. "It was," she replied simply. Layla realized that the routine in the mansion, even though it was well planned and comfortable, was not enough to stop the internal conflicts around her. Every day, she felt more empty, as if she were physically present but disconnected from what was happening around her. While Henry kept his usual serious attitude, Layla felt like there was more to him than he let on. One morning, she was surprised by an unexpected request from Henry. He wanted to talk to her after breakfast, which was unusual for him. Layla met him in the living room. He was waiting next to a stack of papers. "I want to discuss some additional details of the contract," he said directly. Layla's heart tightened, imagining he was about to impose new conditions. More details, she thought. "I thought everything was already settled." "It's nothing that changes the terms," Henry replied. "I just want to ensure you understand how things will be after the birth. I don't want any surprises." Layla took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I think I understand. I'll leave. You'll go on with your life." He nodded. "Yes. I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, I'll be available to help. I don't want birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Layla took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I think I get it. I'll leave. You'll go on with your life. He nodded in agreement. Yes. I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the offer. His tone was different, as if he was trying to show a consideration that hadn't been there before. That's unexpected coming from you, she said, unable to hide her sarcasm. Henry just shrugged. I don't want complications. This is the best way to avoid complications. Layla chuckled. There was something about his seriousness that made her reconsider her sarcasm. Maybe he really was trying to be different, even if he didn't quite know how. Later that day, Layla decided to explore the mansion further. The place was immense, with seemingly endless hallways and rooms decorated with artwork that probably cost more than she could imagine. As she wandered, she came across a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside. Henry was sitting at the desk. He didn't seem to be working. I don't want complications. Henry just shrugged. He was holding a framed photograph in his hands, staring at it. Layla couldn't make out the details of the image. Something about his posture caught her attention. It was the first time she'd seen him like this, vulnerable, lost in thought. She knocked softly on the door. He quickly set the photograph back on the desk. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt, she said hesitantly. Henry looked up, clearly surprised to see her. It's nothing, he replied, returning to his neutral expression. Did you need something? No. I was just exploring the house. Layla hesitated, feeling like she should say more. You seemed like you were thinking about something important. Henry stayed silent for a moment before replying. We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves. Sensing he didn't want to continue that topic, she shifted the conversation. This house is huge. Do you live here alone all the time? He nodded, crossing his arms. It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions. Here I have the space I need. Layla studied him for a moment, trying to understand how someone could live surrounded by so much luxury and yet seem so lonely. That must be strange, she said. I don't want complications. Henry looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do. I want to believe you. Something in your tone suggests otherwise. Before you respond, if you need anything, Stephanie can help. Henry stood up, ending the conversation. That night, Layla went out to the mansion's terrace. The sky was clear. The city lights twinkled in the distance. Sitting there, she let her mind wander. She thought about the sound of the baby's heartbeat she had heard during the checkup. She felt hurt. She heard a sound that affected her in ways she couldn't explain. She tried to stay calm. It was hard. When she heard footsteps behind her, Layla turned and saw Henry. He looked tired. He still had the same stiff posture. You like this spot, don't you? He asked as he approached. I like the silence, she replied. It helps me think. He stopped beside her and gazed at the city lights for a moment before speaking. Thinking isn't always a good thing, he said. Layla laughed. She didn't feel much like it. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. Henry didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Sometimes Being surrounded by people doesn't help much either. Layla glanced at him, noticing a sadness in his words she hadn't heard before. Maybe you need something you can't control, she said without filtering her thoughts. She didn't regret it. He frowned as if he wanted to respond. Decided against it. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Layla with her own thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Layla realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep her distance from Henry. He was mysterious. Sometimes she could tell that he was really a good person. She tried to stay away from him. She also wanted to understand him. Henry had feelings that he couldn't explain. He thought the plan would be easy. It was hard. He realized that Layla wasn't just part of the plan. He was scared. The next week, it was time for another checkup. Layla woke up early, feeling nervous and excited. The months were passing quickly. She was excited to see the babies, even if it was on a screen. She wondered if Henry would be there for the appointment, just like he had been the last time. When she came down for breakfast, she found Stephanie going over the schedule with Henry. "Ready?" Henry asked, looking up from the folder of documents in front of him. "Ready," Layla replied, trying to sound she felt calmer than usual. "Great. We'll go together." He didn't explain any more. His tone made it clear that there would be no discussion. Layla went to the car, feeling the silence between them heavier than usual. Henry, as always, was focused. He seemed different. Maybe he was as nervous as she was, though he would never admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them with a warm smile. He motioned for Layla to lie down while he prepared the ultrasound equipment. "Today, the doctor explained that they were going to adjust the monitor to get a clearer view of the baby." Layla looked at the screen, trying to ignore the cold gel the doctor was applying to her abdomen. When the transducer began to glide over her skin, she held her breath, anxious about what was to come. Henry, standing beside her, crossed his arms, keeping his eyes fixed on the monitor. Then the sound came, the strong, steady rhythm of heartbeats. Not just one, two. "Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time," the doctor said, pointing to the screen. "You say you're expecting twins?" Layla's eyes widened in surprise. She had never thought that was possible. She felt a mix of shock and joy. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her belly, trying to process the news. Henry, his part, remained silent for a few seconds. His serious expression gave way to something Layla had never seen before, genuine awe. He leaned slightly forward, watching the screen intently. "Two?" he asked, as if needing confirmation. The doctor replied with a smile. "Both seem healthy and are growing well." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of the heartbeats echoing in the room. Layla. That moment was magical. No matter how hard she tried to stay emotionally distant, she couldn't help but feel connected to the two lives inside her. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who did hear will understand. Now, let's continue with the story. Henry, he was also moved. He didn't say anything. His eyes showed that he felt something deep. The first time, he seemed weak and touched by the idea of becoming a father to two children. On the way back to the mansion, the silence between them was different. It wasn't the usual cold and distant silence. Something full of meaning. Layla finally broke the silence. You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised, she commented, trying to make the tension feel less intense. Henry let out a deep breath, looking ahead at the road. I'm not, he said, pausing to choose his words carefully. This is different. Layla looked at him, intrigued. Henry didn't show his emotions often. Now he seemed lost in thought. Is it scary? She asked, her voice barely audible. He turned slightly to look at her before answering. No. It's impressive. Knowing that, in a few months, 2 completely new beings will be here. Depending on me. Layla felt a sharp pain in her chest. She knew that eventually, she would have to let go of those babies. Hearing him talk about them with such care made her realize how connected she already was to them. They also depend on me. At least for now, she said, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. Henry nodded. I know. That's why I want to make sure you're okay. Layla. Not just physically. In every way. That's important to me. She stayed silent, absorbing his words. It was the first time he had spoken so sincerely about what they were going through together. Later that night, Layla was on the terrace. Henry appeared again, looking at the horizon. He seemed hesitant, which was unusual for him. I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today. He started sitting next to her. 2 babies. 2 futures. Layla turned to him, surprised by how open he was being. It's a lot of responsibility. Isn't it? She asked. Henry looked out at the horizon, seeming unsure. This was unusual for him, as he was usually very confident. I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today. He said. He said that we're going to have 2 babies. That we'll have to figure out how to raise them. It's a lot of responsibility. Isn't it? Layla asked. It's more than that, Henry said, looking out at the horizon. This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these 2 will become. I can't control who they'll grow into. Layla felt a chill when she heard those words. It was rare for Henry to admit that something was beyond his control. Henry said he was looking at the horizon. Layla felt a chill. She realized that he was changing. He didn't seem to want it. Sometimes that can be a good thing, she said. Not knowing what's next can bring things you never imagined. Henry looked at her as though he were considering her words. The first time, he seemed to be accepting the idea that not everything in life could be planned. She realized that, like her, he was changing. He didn't seem to want to. Sometimes, that can be a good thing, she said. Not knowing what's next can bring unexpected things. Henry looked at her as though he were considering her words. The first time, he seemed to be accepting the idea that not everything in life can be planned. In the following days, the news about the twins brought an unexpected lightness to the mansion. Stephanie began making adjustments to the nursery that had been prepared, now adapting it for 2. Layla watched the transformations with mixed feelings. She knew the agreement required her to give up the babies. Deep down, she knew the agreement required her to give up the babies. Deep down, she realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Layla and Henry started to see that the contract that had united them was turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following the revelation of the twins brought a subtle yet significant shift in Layla and Henry's relationship. Though he remained the same as always, small gestures began to emerge, revealing a side of him Layla hadn't expected. One afternoon, after a medical appointment, Henry insisted on escorting her to the car. He would usually leave to Stephanie or another staff member. "Are you okay?" he asked, holding the car door open for her. Layla nodded, surprised by the gesture. "Yes. I'm fine. Thank you," she replied. On the drive back to the mansion, their usual silence was broken when Henry asked, "Is there anything you need? Anything that might make you more comfortable?" Layla glanced at him, trying to read his expression. He didn't seem concerned about something superficial. There was something more genuine about him, though she wasn't sure how to interpret it. "Nothing came to mind right now. Thank you for asking." He nodded and returned his focus to the road. Layla sensed that something was changing, despite her doubts. Henry seemed genuinely concerned about her. Back at the mansion, Layla noticed more signs of change. One day, she found a set of new pillows and blankets in her room, along with a simple note that read, "To help you rest better." She couldn't help but smile as she realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Layla and Henry started to see that the contract that had united them was turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following, the gesture. It was a small act. It carried meaning. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, Henry entered and quietly sat in the armchair opposite her. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though he still looked serious. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. "Yes. I did. It was thoughtful of you." "You?" Layla replied, studying him curiously. "Good, that I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me," he said without looking away. Layla frowned slightly. As much as she appreciated the kindness, there was still a barrier of mistrust she couldn't quite overcome. "You're changing, Henry. At least it seems that way. I still don't know why," she said directly. He stared at her for a moment, as if deciding what to say. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe you're right, maybe I am changing, but the truth is, I don't know how to be different. That I'm not used to caring." The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. It was rare to see Henry admit any. Layla realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Layla and Henry started to see that the contract that had united them was turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following were full of vulnerability. There he was, revealing a part of himself that always seemed locked away. That night, Layla reflected on the conversation while gazing at the sky from the terrace. Henry wasn't what she had expected. He was still hard to figure out. There was something human beneath that controlling exterior. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Henry was in his office, looking at the contract that defined his agreement with Layla. The first time, he felt the weight of that document. He had started this with a clear goal, to have an affair and move on with his life, but now things weren't so simple. He knew he was. She realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Layla and Henry started to see that the contract that had united them was turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The next morning, Henry joined Layla for breakfast. Something he rarely did. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said directly. "What is it?" Layla looked up. "Curious. I know you still don't trust me. I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people." She realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Layla and Henry started to see that the contract that had united them was turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following. "People. That's turned me into someone who maybe isn't easy to deal with." Layla stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've had experiences that taught me not to depend on anyone. To not let anyone get close enough to hurt me. With you. With what we're building. I realize that maybe I'm wrong." She blinked, surprised by his honesty. It was rare to hear Henry talk about himself in this way. "We all have our barriers," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." He nodded, seeming to agree with her. "Maybe you're right," he said. "But changing isn't easy for me." Layla smiled. "No one said it would be," Henry said later that day. It was rare to hear Henry talk about himself this way. "We all have our barriers," Layla said softly. "But that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." He nodded, seeming to consider her words. "Maybe you're right," he said. "But changing isn't easy for me." Later that day, Henry decided to join her for a walk in the garden. They talked about trivial things at first. The conversation soon returned to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, surprising her. "No. Not yet," she replied. "I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own. I think it would be fair to do it together," he replied. They decided to go for a walk in the garden. They talked about simple things at first. Then they started talking about the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, surprising her. "No. Not yet. I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own. I think it would be fair to do it together," he said. She was amazed. She realized that Henry was trying to be more open and present, while she was still cautious. She couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the warm colors of the sky. "I never imagined I'd be here doing something like this," Layla said, almost to herself. She said, "Neither did I." Henry smiled slightly. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Layla looked at him, noticing that for the first time Henry seemed to be letting his guard down. Maybe, just maybe, there's a chance that this isn't just a contract. The beginning of something much bigger. The morning started like any other. Layla felt the weight of the months of pregnancy in every movement. She was determined to keep her routine. Henry, as usual, was in the office, buried in documents. Their interactions, now more frequent, had become a kind of silent comfort for both. But that day, something was different. Just before lunch, Layla felt a sudden pain. It was different from any discomfort she had felt before. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another typical pregnancy ache. The intensity increased. Alarmed, she called Stephanie, who immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. "Henry needs to know about this," Stephanie helped Layla sit down. This could be the start of labor. Layla nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain hit her. Stephanie went to get Henry, who appeared in the room within minutes. Seeing her, his usually impassive face showed something rare, genuine concern. "Layla. What's happening?" he asked. She said, "I think it's happening." In a quick, almost breathless voice. "The babies are coming." Henry seemed a bit shocked. He quickly composed himself. He grabbed the phone and told the driver to get the car ready. He also told Stephanie to gather everything they would need for the hospital. "We're going now," he said. He spoke in a firm voice. It was also urgent. Layla had never heard him speak like that before. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Layla tried to manage the pain. Henry, sitting next to her, watched her with a mix of anxiety and determination. He held her hand during the trip. It was a gesture that seemed automatic. It was full of emotion. "We're almost there," he said, squeezing her hand. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Layla didn't respond. His words made her feel calm. At the hospital, everything happened quickly. A medical team was already ready thanks to Henry's careful planning. Layla was taken straight to the delivery room. He stayed by her side the entire time, refusing to leave even when the staff tried to get him to wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, holding Layla's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." During the hours that followed, Henry witnessed something he never imagined, Layla's strength as she brought the twins into the world. Each moment felt endless. Also very intense. Finally, a cry filled the room. The sound was both small and powerful, like a wave of emotion. "It's a boy," the doctor said, smiling. "He's beautiful and healthy." Henry felt his heart race. He couldn't take his eyes off the baby. He was carefully placed on a nearby table. Before he could fully understand the situation, a second cry filled the room. It was a girl. His daughter Layla. Exhausted but with eyes shining, Layla looked at the two babies being gently cleaned and wrapped in blankets. She wanted to hold them. She knew the moment would be brief. Henry stood. She watched the doctor for a few seconds, feeling frozen. Then, as if something inside him had finally given way, he stepped closer to Layla, took her hand, said, "You were incredible. Thank you." Tears silently streamed down Layla's face. She couldn't tell if they were from joy, relief, a heart already beginning to break. After the babies were handed to her, Layla held them carefully. She felt their warmth and fragility. She studied them, taking in every detail. Their closed eyes and tiny fingers moving involuntarily overwhelmed her with love. She knew it would be impossible to leave them without carrying a part of them. Henry stayed by her side, not saying a word but clearly feeling strong emotions. When he finally held the boy, his usually cold, unemotional face changed in a way Layla had never seen before. It was as if he connected with something beyond this world. It was life in its purest form. A bond he had never experienced when he held the girl. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember the moment. When he opened them, he looked at Layla. She saw something she never expected. He was truly grateful. "They're perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Layla nodded. still holding the boy. Tears fell freely now. She didn't care. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember the moment. When he opened them, he looked at Layla. She saw something she never expected, true gratitude. "They're perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Layla nodded, still holding the baby. Tears fell freely now. She didn't care. That night, while Layla rested in her room, Henry stayed by the baby's side in the hospital observation area. He watched them sleep, feeling a flood of emotions he didn't know how to control. For the first time, he realized these children weren't just part of a plan or a legacy. They were his connection to something greater. He had never allowed himself to feel this way before. Stephanie arrived carrying coffee. She placed the cup on a nearby table and gently asked, "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" Henry looked at her, clearly struggling to find the right words. "For the first time in a long while, I think it is," he replied. Stephanie smiled and she left, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his children. Meanwhile, Layla woke up in her room, feeling a heavy loneliness as much as she wanted to be happy. She knew the contract still loomed over everything, the baby, now the center of her existence, wouldn't be hers for much longer. But when she looked at the door and saw Henry walked in with both babies in his arms, something inside her shifted. He looked different, as if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. "I don't know how. This has changed everything," he confessed. Layla nodded, knowing that no matter how difficult what came next would be, this moment was a miracle she would never forget. Months later, Henry's mansion was filled with silence. Layla knew what the day meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been a mix of joy and anguish. She loved Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. Something inside her shifted. He looked different. It was as if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. "I don't know how. This has changed everything." He had changed them more than she ever thought possible. The contract was clear. Her time there was coming to an end. Today was the day she was supposed to leave everything behind. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, Layla glanced at the babies' cribs, where they still slept peacefully. Tears threatened to fall. He didn't cry. She didn't want her last memories to be of weakness. She knew what she had signed and tried to convince herself it was the right thing to do. Stephanie knocked softly on the door and entered with a worried expression. "Is everything ready?" she asked quietly. Layla nodded, swallowing her emotions. "Yes, thank you for everything." Stephanie the assistant looked at her, hesitating before speaking. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis." Layla forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. "It's not about what I want, it's about what was agreed upon." Stephanie didn't press further. She simply Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. Layla felt a strong emotion in her throat. She remained calm. He looked different, as if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. "I don't know how. This has changed everything." He left the room, promising to let Henry know that Layla was ready to leave. When she came down the stairs with her suitcase in hand, Layla found Henry waiting in the foyer. He was standing by the front door, his eyes fixed on her. There was no trace of the cold, calculating man she had met at the beginning. The Henry standing there. Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. Something inside her shifted. He looked different. As if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. I don't know how. This has changed everything. He seemed different. Vulnerable. As if he was about to lose something important. Everything's ready, Layla said, breaking the silence. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step towards her, his gaze intense. Are you really leaving? He asked, his voice low and almost hoarse. Layla felt a lump in her throat. She remained firm. Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. Something inside her changed. He looked different. It was as if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. I don't know how. This has changed everything. He was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on. Henry stood still for a moment, before reaching into the inside pocket of his coat, pulling out the contract. He held the document between his fingers, as if it was something insignificant. This contract, he began, his voice steadier now, should never have defined what's. Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. She felt something change inside. He looked different. As if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. I don't know how. This has changed everything between us. Before Layla could respond, Henry tore the paper into pieces, letting them fall to the floor. The sound echoed through the foyer like a declaration. I don't want you to go, Layla. I don't want this to end here. Layla froze, her eyes fixed on the pieces of paper on the floor. Her heart raced. She felt pain and fear. Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. She felt something change inside. He looked different. As if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. I don't know how. This has changed everything. He kept her hesitant. Henry, you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple. He took another step towards her, his expression full of emotion. I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me. These past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to. Henry admitted. I need you, Layla, not just because of the twins. Because you brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing. His words hit her hard. She shook her head, trying to resist. And how do I know this is real? She asked, her voice trembling. How can I trust that you won't change your mind? That you won't? Henry walked in with both babies in his arms. Something inside her changed. He looked different. As if that moment had changed not just his relationship with the babies, also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, sat beside her, holding the girl. I don't know how. This has changed everything. He pulled away when things got tough. Henry took a deep breath, seeming to struggle with his own insecurities. I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone. It left me empty. You showed me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human. Yes. It scares me. I don't want to lose this. Lose you. Layla felt tears streaming down her face. She couldn't overcome a barrier. I fell in love with you, Henry, she admitted, her voice choking with emotion. But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded and ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same? Henry moved closer. Close that she could feel his breath, because you changed everything for me. I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly, that I don't know how to prove it to you. Layla. I'm willing to try every day for the rest of my life if you give me that chance. His words hit her hard. Layla. Henry moved closer. Close that she could feel his breath. You changed everything for me. I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you. Layla. I'm willing to try every day for the rest of my life if you give me that chance. His words hit her hard. Layla felt something inside her about to give way. She knew there were risks. For the first time, she considered that maybe it was worth facing them. What if it doesn't work out? She asked, almost in a whisper. Henry took her hands, looking directly into her eyes. Then we'll try again and again. If necessary. I won't give up on you. Layla felt something inside her about to give way. She knew there were risks. For the first time, she thought it might be worth facing them. What if it doesn't work out? She asked, almost in a whisper. Henry took her hands and looked directly into her eyes. Then we'll try again and again if necessary. I won't give up on you. Never. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Layla felt her doubts begin to fade, replaced by something stronger, hope. She looked at Henry, realizing that he was truly willing to let go of his control and his barriers to be with her. Finally, she nodded, letting the tears fall freely. Okay. I'll stay, Henry said, letting out a sigh of relief. Layla felt like everything was possible. She looked at Henry, who was ready to let go of his control and barriers. Finally, she nodded, letting the tears fall. Okay. I'll stay, Henry said. Embraced her. The first time, Layla felt that this was where she was meant to be. The day was just beginning at Henry's mansion. Layla woke up to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. There was something different about that morning. The first time in a long while. She didn't feel Layla felt at ease. As if she belonged somewhere. The first time. It was just starting to get light outside Henry's big house. Layla woke up to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. Something was different about that morning. The first time in a long while. She didn't feel the weight of uncertainty or the tension of living under the terms of a contract. She had chosen to stay. And, more importantly, Henry had chosen to open his heart, allowing them to build something together. Layla got up and went to the nursery. She found the two little ones awake, cooing softly as they moved in their cribs. She leaned over the babies, stroking their rosy cheeks and whispering words of affection. Then, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Henry. He stood in the doorway, smiling at the scene. His eyes, which had always looked controlled and distant, were now softer. Layla felt a sense of belonging, as if she had always been meant to be there. It was just starting to get light outside Henry's big house. Layla woke up to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. That morning, she felt a different kind of feeling. Something she couldn't describe as love. "Good morning," Henry said as he walked into the room and approached the babies. "Good morning," Layla said as Henry picked up the baby boy in his arms. He looked at the baby with a sparkle in his eyes. "I don't think I ever imagined this moment would feel so natural," he confessed, almost to himself. Layla smiled, watching him grow into his role as a father. There was something deeply fulfilling about seeing him so devoted to the twins. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment. Henry, though inexperienced, made an effort to learn how to care for the babies, helping Layla whenever he could. He changed diapers, though he was a bit clumsy at first, giving bottles and even singing lullabies, despite his gravely voice not being the most melodic. For Layla, this dedication was proof that he was truly changing. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the twins sleeping in their cribs nearby, Henry turned to Layla. "I've been thinking about something." Henry's expression was serious but calm. "What is it?" she asked, curious. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I want us to be a real family. Not just because of the twins. Because I want you by my side forever." Layla was silent, taken aback by the intensity of his words. She knew their feelings for each other had grown. She felt a strong desire to be with him. Not because of contracts or obligations. Because of love. Henry said, "I want that. Too. I want that. Too," Layla replied. A few weeks later, they held a small ceremony in the mansion's gardens. Only a few close people were invited. Including the day was perfect. The sun was shining. There was a gentle breeze. The flowers around the venue were in bloom. Layla wore a simple yet elegant dress. Henry looked sharp in a suit. The twins, dressed adorably, were in Stephanie's arms. The first time, Layla felt that this was where she was meant to be. The day was just breaking at Henry's mansion. Layla woke to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. There was something different about that morning. The first time in a long while. She didn't feel something with you. Something that's not based on contracts or obligations. On love. His words were sincere. Layla knew it. Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "I want that. Too. Henry. Let's try." A few weeks later, an intimate ceremony was held in the mansion's gardens. Only a few close people were invited, including Stephanie and the other staff members who had become an important part of their journey. The day was perfect. With the sun shining and a gentle breeze moving through the flowers that decorated the venue, Layla wore a simple yet elegant dress. While Henry looked sharp in a suit, the twins, dressed adorably, were in Stephanie's arms. She couldn't hold back her tears of joy when Henry and Layla exchanged vows. They both spoke from the heart. Henry promised to be the man she deserved. Someone who would always stand by her, no matter what that in turn. Layla promised to trust him and help him become the best version of himself. At the end of the ceremony, as they stood, the first time, Layla felt like this was her true place. The day was just beginning at Henry's mansion. Layla woke up to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. Something was different about that morning. The first time in a long time. She didn't feel like she needed to embrace each other while holding the twins. Stephanie said, "You make a beautiful family." It was true. The first time. Henry. Layla. The babies were exactly where they were meant to be. After the ceremony, life continued with its challenges. Also with moments of joy. Henry and Layla worked together to create a warm. They loved their home with the twins. They learned to be parents. Facing sleepless nights and constant demands. With a mix of exhaustion and happiness. One night, as Layla was putting the babies to bed, Henry appeared at the bedroom door. He walked up to her and embraced her without saying a word. Layla rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become so familiar. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said softly. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again," she replied. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Henry and Layla were in the garden watching the twins play on a soft mat in the grass. The babies laughed or filled the air, spreading pure, infectious joy. Layla turned to Henry, who was sitting beside her. Saw him smiling. "Are you happy?" she asked. Genuinely curious. He looked at her and then at the twins before answering. "I never thought I could be this happy. You've given me that happiness. I needed Layla more than I ever knew. I needed a family. A purpose. Love." Layla smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "You've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges. Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins began to babble something that sounded like "Mama." Henry and Layla laughed, overwhelmed with emotion. Moved closer to the little ones, wrapping them in all the love they had. That moment was simple. They had found something real. They were not fooling themselves. Their life was not perfect. They had love, understanding, hope. That was all they needed to move forward. What did you think of Henry's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories. And don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.